All right, welcome to the Climate Action Committee. We'll start with roll call. Committee member Breeding is not here yet. Committee member Choi? Here. Committee member Cooper?
Here.
Committee member Larson?
Here.
Committee member Martin is on her way. Committee member Peterson?
Here.
Committee member Way?
Here.
I think that's the way it goes, sorry.
All right, so next we have approval of the minutes from your October 16th meeting. It was in your agenda packet.
I don't have any comments.
Any comments?
Questions or discussion?
Any edits to the minutes or approved?
No.
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second?
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. So at the beginning of the meetings, thank you everybody for coming tonight. It's great to see you all. We have a time at the very beginning of the meeting where the public can comment. You have 3 minutes to talk on anything you want to talk about that's not on the agenda. The committee can't respond or like take any action on it, but we can hear public comments. So if anybody has anything that they want to start off with, you're welcome to take the podium. All right. So we'll move on to announcements.
All right, we'll start off with an exciting update. We have a new student member, committee member Sarah Choi, and I'll give her a minute to give an introduction to the committee.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm a junior at Albany High, and I wanted to join the Climate Action Committee because I'm currently taking AP Environmental Science, and we've been learning about the effects of climate change and how what we do is affecting it and making the problems worse. So I wanted to join this committee and just help be a part of the process and help make a difference in our community. Thank you.
Yay, welcome aboard.
Welcome.
Are you in the EdSet program?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
All right, so now we'll move on to sustainability events and resources. We had our Healthy Homes workshop last Sunday at the Albany Community Center, which was co-hosted by the Ecology Center, City of Berkeley, Stop Waste, Bayren, City of Albany. And we had 64 people in attendance, which was exciting, and there were a lot of great questions. The event was from 2 to 3, but the last people left the room at around 3:55, so people were really into the event. So that was exciting. They learned about improving indoor air quality, energy efficiency, and there was also related the theme of electrification, because they all kind of intertwine. This Saturday, there's a Friends of Albany Parks cleanup on the Albany Bulb starting at 9 a.m. There's more details about that on our website. Community-wide resources, there's currently 3 EV discount opportunities available for Bay Area residents. The first is a new resource, which is the Drive Clean Bay Area group collaborative, and they're coordinating a group purchase of EVs to bring down the cost for customers. The group purchase collaborative is offering 11 electric or hybrid models with an additional $1,300 to $6,000 off the MSRP on top of the federal tax credit, state rebate, and PG&E rebate. More can be learned at drivecleanbayarea.org. However, it's important to note that this program is only available through December 31st, 2019. The next resource is the Bay Area Air Quality Management District Clean Car for All program. It's still offering or accepting applications for income qualified Bay Area residents to retire their older vehicle and replace it with a hybrid electric, plug-in hybrid electric, or battery electric vehicle, or to get a Clipper card for use on public transit. And the third is the Bay Area SunShares program has extended its deadline to November 30th, so there's 10 more days to access group purchase opportunity for solar and the 2019 Nissan Leaf. Do any committee members have announcements? announcements on resources they know of. Right. And our last update is our all-electric ordinance, which the committee saw at their last meeting and forwarded to council, went to Planning and Zoning Commission on October 16th. They gave feedback and asked staff to bring it back to their October 23rd meeting once we had incorporated some of their edits. Mainly, it was just clarifying the language for the ordinance. On October 23rd, they had a second discussion about the ordinance, and they made a motion to forward the ordinance to City Council for review, and the ordinance is planned to go to City Council for their first reading during their December 16th meeting. And the way it works is there will be a first reading, and then they'll have a second reading, and then the ordinance, if adopted, will become effective 30 days after the second reading of the ordinance.
Were there any changes or any
You don't remember what
substantive changes?
Is
or
it
anything?
City
Is
Hall?
it pretty much how we saw it?
guest?
The only changes were really clarifying the language so that it made more sense within our code language. So there were just some clarifications and a couple definition changes, or we took out some redundancies about exemptions, but the basic premise of the ordinance, no natural gas in new constructions, is the same.
Great.
Yeah, I think you're right. I thought it was the guest.
All right. Any other announcements or things like that? No? Okay. So we'll go ahead and go to the presentation.
Perfect. So we're very excited to have Trevor from Stop Waste here to give a presentation on carbon farming for the committee. Oh, sorry. We'll do a presentation followed by time for question and answer from Trevor.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Trevor Probert. I am a program services specialist at Stop Waste. Are folks familiar with who Stop Waste is? So Stop Waste is a public agency for Alameda County. We are governed by 3 boards: the Alameda County Waste Management Authority, the Source Reduction and Recycling Board, and the Energy Council. And as a public agency, our role is to help residents, businesses, as well as our member agencies, which include the cities and the county itself, in waste reduction projects. And so we support cities in managing their waste stream, and for Stop Waste, a major focus as an agency has become climate change. And so we have been focusing very heavily on the organics waste stream. And so for residents of Albany, often we are engaged with the organics waste stream through putting things into the green bin. And so organics include food scraps, yard trimmings, anything that's making its way into the green bin. One benefit of composting those materials are diverting it from the landfill and preventing methane generation. But my role lately has been to do outreach and communications around sustainable landscaping and gardening, the benefits of using compost as we're diverting organics from the landfill. It is going into production of compost as a product. And so what I'm here to present to you tonight are what is compost, and then some really exciting research that's come out between the connection of using compost and carbon farming. If folks are not familiar with carbon farming is a whole host of strategies to maximize the amount of carbon sequestration in soils. And for a committee like this who's supporting the city of Albany on their climate action plan, hopefully this information on carbon farming will be of interest to you. A little bit of background about compost. Have folks used compost either in their gardens or landscapes before? So compost happens at a whole bunch of different scales. I mostly work with home gardeners through our home gardener education program. I also work with urban farms on their on-site composting. And so those are small and mid-scale compost producers. For the most part, folks, if they're not backyard composting, you are participating in the compost production through using your green bin. And so whenever you put materials into your green bin, it eventually ends up at a facility like this. This is a commercial composting facility. This is Waste Management's facility out in Redwood City. And So a commercial composting facility like this, it's a permitted process. It will often be put up to a standard such as the OMRI certification to determine the quality of the compost. And compost itself has so many benefits for soil, and for a long time, Stop Waste has been educating home gardeners and professional landscapers on the benefits of using compost. And specifically with urban soils, there's a huge need for compost. Understanding why compost is important, we need to understand what soil is. So soil is mostly mineral particles. The pores between the mineral particles are filled with air and water. And then a small portion of soil is made of organic matter. And organic matter is the part that allows soil to be a living ecosystem. It houses the soil microbes that are doing nutrient cycling. Organic matter acts as a sponge and helps soils hold on to moisture. And it also is the part of soil that promotes healthy root functions and allows roots to go deep into soil. And that's especially important for urban soils because through the processes of development, whether it's through excavating soils or compacting soils or even importing soil as fill, that soil has effectively lost its organic matter through oxidation and other practices or for other reasons. And so there's a huge opportunity and also a huge need for urban soils to replenish that organic matter by using compost. And so as an agency, for a long time, we've been promoting the benefits of compost, making sure that there's a healthy market for the use of compost. And then recently, within the last 5 to 7 years, there's been some really exciting research, the connection between using compost and carbon sequestration in soils. So this is an image taken from the Marin Carbon Project. Have folks heard of the Marin Carbon Project? So the Marin Carbon Project is a consortium of organizations working together. There's the landowners for this grazeland out in Marin County. There's the Carbon Cycle Institute, and then there's a researcher, Wendy Silver, based out of UC Berkeley, that decided to do an experiment. And they took the land and broke it up into different plots, and they applied compost to some of the plots. And what they were able to measure afterwards were, for the plots that had compost, and you might notice that the cattle was attracted to those plots. They found that the forage had nearly doubled in production. The forage itself had higher nutrient value. And then the soils had an increased water holding capacity between 15 to 25%, which is huge. What they also were able to measure, which is really exciting and was not necessarily unexpected, but was new information, was that using that single half-inch application of compost on those plots, they measured that soil had sequestered an additional 1.5 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. And what they found, and that does not include the actual carbon that was added through the compost itself. They subtract out that amount of carbon. So what they found was by applying organic matter in the form of compost, it stimulated a reaction in the soil, in the microbiology, that led to a positive feedback loop that allowed the plants, which are now in a healthier soil, to take in more carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. The plants take the carbon dioxide and transform it into carbohydrates, which they then exude out their roots. And then the carbohydrates are fed to the soil microorganisms. And there's a researcher from UC Davis who says that about 80% of organic matter in soils is made of dead microbial bodies. And so by feeding the soil compost, it led to this feedback loop that increased the population of soil microbes and then increased the organic matter found in the soil through this process. So it's really exciting that 1.5 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, that same rate of carbon sequestration occurred over the next 5 years without any additional applications of compost. And through some modeling using the soil testing data that they had taken on, they predict that same process that will occur at the same rate for the next 30 years with additional benefits for the next 100 years. That led to more research happen. So there's another tool online called the Comet Planner. The Comet Planner takes data that's coming from the Century Project, which is a 100-year experiment happening with UC Davis. And they found a number closer to 5 metric tons of carbon dioxide per acre per year. And this just goes to show, those are different soils. The point that I'm trying to make is that an application of compost led to this carbon sequestration action. Urban soils are very different than the soils that they did these experiments on. So there seems to me that there's an opportunity, because urban soils are so devoid of organic matter, that there seems to be a lot of opportunities to see how urban soils would respond to applications of compost. This is especially interesting for folks who are working on climate action plans or climate action and adaptation plans, especially when the implementation process happens. And there's no data for urban soils. So I'll explain a little bit the work that Stop Waste is doing to try to find more data from urban soils. And then we're also really looking to cities and community organizations to partner with us to try to gather more data as well.
Have you looked at the bulb?
What's that?
Have you looked at the Albany bulb?
No, I haven't. We should, when we have questions and afterward, I'd love to chat more about that. So there's this great quote from Dr. Christine Jones, who's a soil ecologist in, what's the continent? She's a soil ecologist, and she measures in healthy soils up to 40% or more of the plant photosynthate, what plants absorb through photosynthesis, flows directly to the soil ecosystem via the liquid carbon pathway. It's that process of plants taking carbon through photosynthesis and then transferring it to soil through their roots. And for a lot of, Stop Waste has looked at lots of climate action plans for cities, and it seems that there's this pattern where cities are looking to urban forestry programs and tree plantings as their form and mechanism for carbon sequestration. And what we want to help, we kind of want to re-look at this situation where if we took land-based carbon sinks, the places on land where carbon is stored, and you divided up the carbon, about 75% of the carbon stored on land is found in soil, and 25% of the carbon found on land is found in plants, trees, and perennials. And so when cities and community groups are trying to do carbon sequestration projects, if they're focused just on planting trees, they're missing this whole other component, the 75% of carbon that's stored in soils. We consider that, folks really need to be considering soil first. It starts with soil. Healthy soil leads to healthy plants. The healthier the plants and trees are, the more carbon that they'll be taking through photosynthesis and transferring to the soil. And you can just, by looking at this soil, it looks like chocolate cake. Folks know what healthy soil looks like, and we know what unhealthy soil looks like. Urban soils are in need of organic matter. There's a huge opportunity by using compost to kind of reinvigorate the soil by adding and feeding this organic matter and hopefully we can see a stimulus of carbon sequestration the way that these researchers have found on working lands. Real quick before I go to the next slide, some interesting research is also coming out from not UC Santa Barbara, but in Santa Barbara County, a soil ecologist down there. They were doing radiocarbon dating of carbon found a meter deep in soil. And they found that the age of the carbon a meter deep in soil was anywhere between 800 years old to 4,000 years old. And so when we're thinking about carbon sequestration as an action for combating climate change, it's not enough to sequester carbon in a tree that might get pruned. It might die from drought, prolonged drought. Fire is not necessarily out of the question nowadays. But with soil, we're looking at carbon sequestration that can happen on a timescale of thousands of years. And that's the type of action that we need if we're serious about combating climate change. It's worth mentioning that using compost is not the only carbon farming practice. Carbon farming really is looking at your landscape or your garden, whatever scale you're at, looking at it through the lens of carbon. And so other practices for carbon farming include minimizing soil disturbance and maximizing soil cover. Those two practices protect the carbon that's already in your soil. Through urban development, carbon has been lost through oxidation and a number of other processes. And minimizing soil disturbance, if you're a gardener, that means no-till or low-till. If for maximizing soil cover, that means using mulches, or if you're growing edibles, that's cover crops. That prevents carbon from leaving the soil through oxidation. Maximizing continuous living roots and maximizing biodiversity. If you have, the more roots that you have in the soil and the more diversity of roots you have in the soil, the more diverse microbial populations you have. And the more diverse microbial populations you have, the more stable the soil is in terms of soil carbon sequestration. And of course, we are always hoping folks are avoiding synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. They are links to nitrous oxide emissions. They're also, if used incorrectly, can harm microbial populations in soil, which are absolutely necessary when it comes to carbon sequestration. So at Stop Waste, what are we doing for carbon farming? I'm really happy that Hillary Sardinius is here. We've partnered with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. They're helping us develop a carbon farm plan when we're actually beginning the plan next week. A carbon farm plan for a property that we own out in the Altamont Hills. We have a 1,600 acre, it's grazing land really, and we're trying to continue to do research in a similar pathway that the Marin Carbon Project has done through this carbon farming plan. But we need more data for urban soils. And so we've partnered with 8 urban farms in the county, many who are, in Oakland and all across the county. And through carbon farming practices, as well as applying compost, we are measuring soil carbon to see what the soil response is after these practices have been done. What we're really interested in doing is finding folks who are researchers that can really take this idea and run with it and see what type of research that they can come up with. My role really is public outreach and education, and so I'm constantly giving workshops on gardening, composting, carbon farming. I'm giving presentations. This is one of many community and city presentations that I'll be giving over the next year. We table at events. I'm really, one reason I'm here is to reach out to folks in Albany. If you are a part of community organizations, or you're a part of a network of folks who would be interested in carbon farming, or at least learning, or gaining some of these resources that we have to offer, please chat with me. We have our own network of folks that we work with, but we're limited by who we know. Sometimes we miss groups who are interested in doing this work, and so please reach out to me if this is something that might be of interest to you or folks that you know. We also provide technical assistance to urban farms. This also includes, we're kind of maxed out on the soil testing that we're doing right now. However, we are providing a citizen scientist training in the winter for folks who are home gardeners or professional landscapers who are interested in learning how to test their own soil for carbon. So I think it's really exciting for home gardeners to be able to measure carbon farming or their carbon sequestration in their own backyard. How can Albany take the lead on carbon farming? Really, if you are helping us promote the use of compost to build healthy soil, that's really what carbon farming practices are. They're healthy soil building practices. They have this additional benefit of carbon sequestration. And so any way that you can promote the use of compost is really important. I know that Kelly Schoonmaker at Stop Waste has provided comments on the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, but when implementation occurs, make sure that soil-based measures are really taken seriously and that they're even considered necessary before tree planting or other urban forestry actions take place. Educate and engage residents. We really are trying to meet people where they're at. Most of the folks that we work with were not necessarily interested in carbon farming to begin with. They were interested in growing food for communities that are hungry. They were interested in having a beautiful garden or landscape. There's ways to meet people and then bring in carbon farming and carbon sequestration as an additional benefit to the work that they're already doing. And then just for folks, everyone should be aware of SB 1383. Have folks heard of SB 1383? It's coming. It's already passed and it's already been signed into law by when Governor Jerry Brown was in office. It begins in January 2022, and it's a statewide ban on organics going to the landfill. That's not the name of the ordinance. It's the short-lived climate pollutant strategy. And organics are essentially banned from the landfill to reduce the methane generation from landfills. What you should know as the community in Albany is that it has the current regulations have a procurement target, which means that cities will be responsible for procuring a certain amount of organic materials products that includes compost. Under the current regs, that means that the city of Albany will be required to procure about 2,163 cubic yards of compost a year. That's a crazy amount of compost. The current regs are really iffy, and we've been trying to provide lots of feedback on them, but know that that's what the current regulations say. And so it might mean that cities will have to be really creative. You're going to have a lot of compost on your hands. Be creative in finding places to put it. And to give you a sense of how much that is, that many cubic yards of compost is enough to spread a half-inch application over 33 acres. I don't know if you have 33 acres of available land, but it's something to be aware of in the future. And then how can you engage in carbon farming right now? This carbon farming is not necessarily new as a practice, but it's new as a message for folks. So if you have any input for us on how carbon farming could resonate with the members of the city of Albany or residents within Albany, we're really appreciative of any feedback that you might have on, how you think folks that are in Albany would be interested in carbon farming. We have a ton of free resources. As a public agency, these resources are free and available to the public. It's just a matter of getting them out to people. Like I said, I provide public workshops, presentations, tabling. We have a bunch of resources for home gardeners and landscape professionals. We have a website with all this information. We also provide grants. We have grants for community organizations and nonprofits, mostly revolving around waste reduction efforts, so food waste reduction, reuse of materials. But we have a relationship with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, and if community organizations are more closely working with, in an urban farm setting, we can help connect you to them to find potential grant opportunities there. There's this quote from R. Hain. He's a soil ecologist during the Dust Bowl. If we feed the soil, it will feed us. Healthy soil is the basis for healthy communities. Carbon farming is really just building healthy soil with this added carbon sequestration benefit. Hopefully this information is useful and interesting to people. I have time to answer some questions. I also have a topic brief about carbon farming that I'll leave in the back if people want to take those. And please, my email is right here. If you ever have questions or comments, or you think there's opportunities for us to partner, please get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I have some questions.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, I was going to open it up for questions. So go ahead.
So one of the aspects we have in the new climate action and adaptation plan, of course, developing sort of more of an urban forest, more planned than sort of what's happening now. And trees have always been focused on, so I'm a little confused about the tree versus just, like say I have a lawn in front of my house that's like 20 by 10. And then there's a little strip where I've planted a tree. Putting compost on the lawn is going to anchor more carbon into the soil and plant that grows there than the tree is going to do? Or do trees just bring in, as they get bigger, they bring in more carbon and put it in lower in the soil in addition into their actual limbs and leaves?
So I don't mean to diminish the value of trees. Trees are a really important part of the urban ecosystem.
Well, trees have the advantage also of doing a lot of shading and other things that we want to do. So I guess, I'm trying to see how this is applicable. I mean, we have a lot of yards in Albany where they've been converting them to indigenous drought-free plants, but you don't see a lot of just, mulching. Those are very carefully planted and irrigated very carefully, and then they just struggle along. So if having like a drought-tolerant yard versus what would be a carbon farming front yard. What's the difference? I mean,
Well, I mean, so we were doing sheet mulching parties for a long time, and a lot of these new drought-tolerant landscapes have been installed using sheet mulching. So folks taking cardboard, compost, and mulch, applying it over the lawn, letting the lawn decompose, and then they plant plants right into the lawn. I mean, that type of installation uses many carbon farming practices. Mulch is really valuable because it protects the carbon that's already in the soil. Mulch also decomposes and adds organic matter over time. Those plants that are California or native plants or drought-tolerant plants, they are deep-rooted perennials most likely, and perennial plants, deep-rooted perennial plants are invaluable in transferring carbon into the soil. There is an argument that grass out in rangeland is a really valuable tool in bringing carbon into the soil, but it's different than lawns, because with lawns, oftentimes with our mowing schedules, we're essentially cutting the grass when it's in its like infantile stage. It wants to grow taller and longer, but we cut it because it looks nicer. And so we're often limiting the ability for lawn to have that carbon sequestration action and develop deep roots. It also depends on what type of lawn you have. There's a lot of great native grasses available now, even in turf grasses. I know Delta Bluegrass has a native grass sod that you can apply. There's I would say, for folks who are interested in having a lawn, I would tell them, consider what type of lawn you have. Deep-rooted perennial or deep-rooted California native grasses have deeper roots than things like Kentucky bluegrass or your Bermuda grass. And any deep-rooted plants are going to have a really positive carbon sequestration potential. And just as far as applying compost to grass, you can apply a thin layer of compost directly on top of a lawn. It will eventually work its way into the soil. It might look kind of funny for a week or so, but I would recommend doing it before a big rain or something. That way it gets incorporated. Did that answer your question?
well, I still don't get an idea of how, like if a tree takes up a certain amount of area, a tree versus just, because in my mind, it's like it's vertical, it's got more leaves, there's more, there's just more photosynthesis going on.
So trees, we don't mean to not have trees. Trees, we want people to consider, a carbon sink. Soil is containing most of the carbon, whereas vegetation is about more 25%. The trees are a mechanism for bringing carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. And trees, they're the most deep-rooted, vegetation that's out there. And so they're really the movers bringing carbon deep in the soil. When I mentioned that, that ecologist in Santa Barbara County, that they were measuring carbon a meter down, I mean, tree roots go down deep and they are transferring carbon through as in the form of carbohydrates as deep as their root structure goes
So
down.
it sounds like they're both of, if anything, maybe equal value or both valuable. We wont put a thing
They're
on it, but-
absolutely dependent on each other.
yeah,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
okay,
Thank
good.
you for clarifying that. Yeah, they are the mechanism for bringing carbon down into the soil, and and plus there's all the other added benefits: urban heat island effect, providing urban habitat.
Okay, good.
Thank you for coming in, Trevor.
Oh, thank you.
Just on the quantity of sequestered carbon, like 1.5 to 5 metric tons per acre per year, is that a fixed number? In other words, is that just there so you'd have that same 1.5 to 5 metric tons in year 10 and year 20? I mean, ideally.
It is not a fixed number.
Does it increase or grow? I'm just wondering, like over a cumulative time frame, if there's a way of thinking about that number.
Yeah, so there was with the Marin Carbon Project, there was a range of carbon sequestration action happening. That 1.5, that's a conversion. They were measuring the carbon in the soil. They had to convert that to carbon dioxide equivalent, and they found a range of like 0.21 I think it was 0.21 metric tons of carbon per acre, all the way up to 1.35 metric tons of carbon per acre. And then take about the average of that and then convert it to carbon dioxide equivalent, it became 1.5 metric tons. So no, there's a range. There is also a correlation between moisture and rain. So in areas that had more rain, they found that the carbon sequestration action was occurring more after a rain period. So water was a limiting factor as well. So, you know, there's something to be said about the impact that compost has on soil. In compost and organic matter acts as the sponge in the soil for holding on to moisture. And so in a place like California, where we're experiencing drier climate for extended periods of time, compost and organic matter helps hold on to the moisture for longer, allows carbon sequestration to continue happening. And then in the flip side, if we have a changing rain regime where we have fewer rain but more intense rainstorms or rain events, the organic matter also acts as almost like a glue or like a cementing agent in the soil particles and helps reduce erosion. And so there's a number of benefits to the compost in relationship to the water availability. And so the answer to your question is water availability was the biggest limiting factor for that range that occurred.
So over time, does the net amount of CO2 that's sequestered, does it essentially grow over time because maybe the plant is getting bigger, getting more
Yes,
root depth and so forth? Is that one way to think about it?
Yeah, so it does accumulate over time. The Marin Carbon Project, that land, when they began their experiment, the organic matter on a percentage basis in their soil was something like in between 2 and 3%. And after 5 years of this ongoing accumulation of carbon, with only a single application of compost, they eventually reached up to like something like 8 to 11% organic matter, which is really insanely high. There is some evidence that, or there is some thought among researchers that soils have a kind of like a cap on how much carbon that they can be saturated with, and carbon itself needs to be balanced with nitrogen. There's a carbon-nitrogen balance happening in soils, and so there are some folks researching that right now about at what point will accumulation stop. So, and I don't have the answer to that question.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. You mentioned an event for home gardeners. Could you just, I tried looking on your website and I couldn't find any information about it. Maybe I just didn't look hard enough, but if you could kind of reiterate what that is, it would be maybe great if we could get some of that information out to the home gardeners in Albany.
Yeah, it doesn't have a date set. It's going to be in January or February. I do know that. Last year we hosted it at the Mills College Community Garden, and I have a feeling that we'll have it there again, but I'm not sure. We have to confirm. And yeah, it will be, I'm happy to provide more information once it's more set in stone.
Great. And what's like the name for it again?
Oh, it's our citizen scientist workshop, and it's focused on teaching folks how to test their own soil.
And we can give information to the committee when it's available, when Trevor provides it. I can send it out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah, and we have a bunch more events. We have composting workshops, worm composting workshops. In the spring, there's a bunch of other things that are going on. It's all being finalized right now. So once we have a set schedule of things, I'm happy to send that over to Lizzie.
I had a question on the Senate Bill 1383 requirement. So when you're saying, 2,163 cubic yards of compost per year for Albany procures it, is that something the city needs to do, or it's all the residents plus the city, or how is that?
It's the responsibility of the city. Procure doesn't necessarily mean purchase. There's a range of meanings behind that, and I'm not an expert on SB 1388. I'm happy to forward you to Kelly Schoonmaker at Stop Waste, who is. But I do know that the city can also give some of that compost to, like let's say, for example, the city of Albany contracted a landscape management group that were, managing landscape, the city of Albany landscapes. That procurement target could feed into that private company's landscaping work that they're doing for the city. Know that those regulations a lot of people are upset about those regulations right now, and it's unfair to cities that are currently, it's complicated, but it's population based, and it's based on an average diversion number coming from the state. And so cities that are diverting a lot of organics from the landfill already, but happen to have high populations, are having to procure a ton of compost compared to other cities that don't necessarily have organics diversion happening and might have smaller populations but have larger areas of land, and they're being asked to procure less compost. So the numbers are a little unfair to some cities, and so hopefully we'll see the written language in that.
I'll look it up and read it, yeah.
Yeah, and once again, I'm happy to forward you to Kelly Schoonmaker. She just presented to our board on SB 1383 today.
I just wanted to go back to the basics for just a sec, just to make sure I got it. So the sequestration of the carbon comes in through the plant, gets sequestered in the soil, and you're saying that if the soil is more rich with organics already, when you plant the tree, then it's better at sequestering carbon than without the mulch, or without the organics. Is that right?
Yes. So the plant roots are dependent on a healthy soil ecosystem. Plant roots are dependent on the microbes, the fungi and bacteria that are present in the soil, and they provide each other. They do a lot of nutrient exchange. And so roots that are in healthy soil with high organic matter and are surrounded by more beneficial microbes, that includes nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they are healthier in general, and healthier plants take in more carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, or at least doing more photosynthesis than unhealthy plants.
Okay. Did you mention, or is there a percentage or some sort of metric of how much more? How much benefit do you get?
No, that's a good question.
Like adding compost?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that.
Okay.
That one, there was a quote from Christine. She mentioned that in healthy soils, up to or more than 40% of the plant photosynthate goes directly to the soil ecosystem. That number, I've heard a lot of people say, but I haven't heard a number of if a plant is in unhealthy soil. So I don't know the contrast to that.
I mean, it just sparked that idea of okay, we're going to plant more trees. We're going to have to take more compost in. So if we implement, composting with tree planting, it fixes more carbon dioxide, and so it sounds like it's all good. So
yeah, I mean, so in the effort to plant more trees, make sure that you're applying compost to the soil as a prep for the trees. Right. Make sure that the trees have sufficient rooting volume because it's really the roots that are transferring the carbon into the soil. So make sure that there's sufficient rooting volume. Compost is great for preventing erosion on slopes. So if you're planting trees on slopes, compost is valuable too. Yeah.
You helped hold a sheet mulching party in the city a few years ago. So I thank you for that. Do you also hold workshops for how to compost for residents?
Yes.
Because I would think ideally if people could compost their own scraps in an efficient way, then you would potentially bypass the whole transportation aspect and distribution, thereby saving indirect emissions and also giving the people the wonderful satisfaction of producing their own black gold. So I'm just wondering how you feel about that and how we can encourage more of that.
Completely agree. I mean, I work most closely with home gardeners and urban farms on site and backyard composting, because they're the ones that are using the compost. They see the value of compost. And when you're in control of the composting process, you know exactly what goes into the compost and what comes out. When it comes to commercial compost, there's a whole range of qualities. and there's the whole infrastructure that's involved in the production of it. There are some really high quality commercial composts in the county, and we're constantly pulling or helping people find those vendors. And then as far as the low quality composts, unfortunately there are commercial compost producers who are tasked with creating a high quality product out of a messy feedstock. So it's really important as residents within the county, if we are putting things in the green bin, if you're putting plastics, metals, or glass in the green bin, that is eventually making its way into the compost. It's eventually making its way into soils. And at a composting facility, they send material through a chipper grinder. So if you have one plastic bag, it goes through the chipper grinder, and all of a sudden you have 1,000 small pieces of plastic now floating in your compost batch. So yes, so home gardeners and urban farmers, community gardeners, we do provide workshops for that audience because home compost is the best compost. And once again, I'm happy to provide the schedule for our upcoming events. We take a break usually in the winter, then the spring kicks up again.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's
Thank you.
Really interesting. That's great. Huh?
I will put the topic brief on carbon farming in the back.
We
Thank
do
you.
questions for the public on presentations? Are there any questions? No? Oh, are there any questions from the public for Trevor?
A quick technical question. So you said if the compostable material goes to landfill, it's going to decompose and cause methane? Wasn't that the same thing that happens when I compost it in my backyard?
No.
What's the difference?
So the question was for materials that are organic materials sent to the landfill, the reason that they produce methane, which as a greenhouse gas, it's something like 80 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over a certain time period. The reason is a landfill is an anaerobic environment. It's without oxygen. And so the microbes that are in a landfill are different than the microbes that would be in your compost pile. Your compost pile is ideally an aerobic environment, meaning that it has lots of air. And so the microbe populations are different, and the byproducts of those microbe populations in the decomposition process produce two different gases. So at a landfill, it is producing methane. In your backyard compost, it's producing a small amount of carbon dioxide. Very small compared to the amount of carbon that is remaining within the finished compost product.
Any other questions?
I'm Hillary Sardinius, and I am an Albany resident. I also am the biologist at the Alameda County Resource Conservation District and work really closely with Stop Waste on a number of their initiatives. Something that Trevor didn't mention is that Stop Waste is working with the city of Dublin and Pleasanton, and they're really pushing the boundaries on incorporating compost into their landscaping. And so I want to challenge Albany to do the same. Nobody really in the coastal part of Alameda County is doing that. So I think Albany, especially given the your new CAAP plan and how you implement it, could do this and really, take the SB 1383 as a challenge. Adding compost can go into a lot of things. There's a lot of sports fields in Albany, and so you could be part of a study, perhaps, to apply compost to these areas and see if you can achieve some of the benefits that you see in rangeland. And then there's also opportunities for education. The Department of Park and Recreation does compost giveaways every year to residents, and so really hyping that up and providing information on the benefits of compost and how that can be applied in those landscapes. So I just see a ton of opportunities to incorporate compost, but as Trevor said, carbon farming is much more expansive. So there are creeks in Albany, and so doing creek restoration, there's studies, there's one called Creek Carbon, also out of Marin, where they found that it sequesters something like 18 metric tons per acre in the tree materials. So I just think that there's all these opportunities that are coming up, and so as you get into thinking about implementation, you can really push the boundaries. Thank you.
Just to add on to that, so I mentioned Comet Planner, which is a tool for rangeland and farmland to try to quantify the amount of carbon sequestration happening through certain practices. Once again, there is no data for urban soils. Our work with Alameda and Dublin is to hope for them to partner with us and to do soil testing to actually get some numbers for urban soil. Eventually, we would like to have a similar sort of online tool where cities can begin quantifying the carbon sequestration impacts of whatever practices they're applying, so that cities can begin to actually have some numbers and data to kind of back up the work that you're doing during implementation.
So on the Senate bill, we have to procure, I'm not sure what that means, but so the city gets all this compost. Are they required to use it within the city? And if the city doesn't have places to reuse it, do they have to like just stockpile it until they can figure it out, or can they give it away to like an urban farm, some private farm, or whatever?
Truthfully, I don't know the answer to that question. Once again, the amount of compost that the city of Albany would be required to procure under the current regulations is an obscene amount. So I don't know the answer to that question. And the city of Oakland is, I know, in a similar, because it's a population-based number. So Oakland having a higher population, the amount that they have to procure is just, it's insane how high the number is. And it's, there's some, I don't want to go into it because I'm not an expert. I wouldn't necessarily be giving you accurate information. But if you are interested, I suggest, yeah, and
Yeah,
there are folks
study into that
there are
later.
folks at Stop Waste who this is more in line with the work that they're doing.
I would also say the regulations are continuing to change, so we really don't have a lot of those answers yet. And some of these answers we won't find out until we can't comply with the regulations. Honestly, I'm not sure.
The final regulation package is coming in January. So in January, we'll know what it actually is. Our thought is that there will be some legislative action afterwards if the regulation package is not of interest to most cities. So we'll see.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so we'll move on to the Climate Action Adaptation Plan final review. So Lizzie sent out the final draft last Friday. It was Thursday or Friday. So we wanted to have the committee have a chance to provide any last feedback. This was based on input from, maybe I should let you, Lizzie, say what it was based on.
So we are coming to you tonight with our final version of the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. We've been working hard the last few weeks to make sure we incorporated all of our final comments. We put it into InDesign, which is why it looks a lot prettier than the Word doc you've been looking at for the last 12 months. We made sure to run through and catch any typos and fix any weird formatting issues, but really this plan should be in its final form. And if it is, something's funky happening with the computer. We're asking tonight that the committee approve the plan so that we can bring it to the city council. Our plan is to bring it to them on December 2nd.
And I thought this was a good opportunity. Hopefully, we've given feedback in several rounds already, so hopefully it's pretty well understood at this point. And so certainly we can go through the committee and provide feedback. But I thought this would, I left time on the agenda because we don't often get time to talk amongst ourselves on the committee here. So I thought it might be a good opportunity to talk about, how that's going and the closure on that, and then the implementation. So why don't we start with any feedback that committee members have on the plan? Sarah, I don't know if you had a chance to see it or. have any comments, but do you have any comments you want to make or any feedback?
Not yet.
Okay.
I don't have anything specific right now.
Okay. I have a few specific things, but I'll go and pass on to you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so on page 6, do you have it so you can we can see it or? No? Okay.
It's the whole system, not the computer.
No.
But this one will work. No? Oh, no? Maybe you're not seeing what I see.
Foiled by technology again. It's funny how that happens.
So.
It's gonna be a little.
Why don't you go ahead? I mean,
Okay, so on page 6, it's the sort of the, it's sort of the scene setting, and with the big blocks on livable, equitable, and it just popped out to me. The second bullet point says clean, locally sourced, renewable energy powers our buildings, buses, cars, improving local air quality. And this whole, none of the 3 bullet points really talk about reducing carbon. And I thought that the second bullet point, our focus isn't really on air quality. I mean, that's nice to have and it's good, but I was thinking if it, if this is the scene setting kind of part of the plan, and it just popped out to me that maybe something about, the focus on, reducing carbon or carbon reduction would be a good thing to put in there instead of the air quality.
or in addition to.
Or in addition to. On page 8, there's the blurb about implementation of the plan, and it says the city will be responsible for oversight of this plan and implementation. I was wondering if we could insert something about the role of the Climate Action Committee and get it, the Climate Action Committee as being an entity that is, forming plans and recommending to the city council on implementation of the Climate Action Plan, just so we have it, in writing that the Climate Action Committee is an essential part of the implementation. And then on page 34, this is just a little nitpicky, but the order of the strategies is in just about every case, it's transportation and then building electrification. And on page 34, building electrification is first. It just is like, I think, people will understand it better if it's just consistent. We just have a nice consistent grouping of the things, so you don't feel like there's too many new concepts coming at you.
Especially since transportation is number 1.
Yes. So, that's it. But it looks really nice.
Okay, I mean, I have quite a few. Okay. So page 18. Let's see, I have a comment on the transport. Oh, actually, this brings up something a little, okay, this is where you have the goals, and I know this is something we've already pretty much set and talked about. And we talked a lot about moving up, and I'm glad to see the 2045 goal for 100%. But what was always kind of surprising to me is, and maybe I lost track of how it happened, but now with the latest sort of evaluation of how we've been doing, we went from going well beyond our 25% goal to a 33% goal. And so going from 33 to 60 in 15 years doesn't seem very hot anymore. And why are we slowing down and pushing a much more steep compliance? What we should be doing is doing as much now, and then the last part's going to be really hard. So the curve is actually going backwards to what it should be doing. And it should be coming down. And I'm not sure if this 25% that they're showing here, when it says actual reduction 33%, I'm not sure which is being shown. Maybe it's the 25. But in my mind, I wish we had really pushed to get to 60% by 2030, just because that's another somewhat like 30%. So that seems like it's workable rather than just, it's almost like we're backing off. You know, we'll just leisurely go along, you know, to 2035, and then all of a sudden we're going to like do this big steep curve to 2045, and I guarantee you that's not the way to approach a plan to do it. You want to have more happening earlier on, so that if you miss, you're not even in deeper straits. So anyway.
I'll just add that, so the 60% goal by 2035 is still the goal that's
Yeah, that didn't change from the original 2010.
yes, so it's
Cap.
our general plans targets were 60% by 2035, carbon neutral by 2050.
Right.
And when we took the climate action plan to the city council in October for their feedback, they had a discussion about targets, and they didn't decide to change the 2035 target, just the carbon neutrality
Right,
target. So
and I understand everything that happened, but I'm just saying, looking at this now in a nice, you know, this chart and the whole thing, it's like we kind of missed the boat on that in my mind. Anyway, I won't belabor that, and I don't know, but I would strongly recommend, or at least discuss whether we can shift that so that we have more action happening sooner rather than kicking it down, expecting a much steeper conversion, which in my mind equals more painful and less likely to happen. So it's just kicking the can. So so going to page 25, I think it would be good there to, you know, if we're going to have all our partners there, EBCE would be shown as one of the utility partners, which it doesn't.
EBCE?
Yeah.
they're next to,
It's
Is it on
in
20?
At 9 o'clock.
Oh, okay, county agencies. I didn't understand why it wasn't under utilities. Okay. Why isn't it under utilities?
It is a county agency.
I don't think they're technically a utility. They're a JPA, so it's like a local government partnership kind
Yeah,
of
okay,
deal.
okay.
So
That's good.
PG&E is still the
I
utility.
didn't see that, so forget that. 26. Let's see, this might be a good place to make a plug for 100% sustainable. I realize that we went with Brilliant 100 as default, but it'd be nice, since people are reading through this, to plug going, maybe they just have down below some little
Pop that up.
graphic that just says, but you can go up to 100% sustainable.
Yeah.
34. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3. I was a little confused by this. When you look at some of the targets that are described, and it says by 2045, some of them are only 90%. How do you get to 100% if you're only at 90%? I don't understand that. What are the 10% of residential buildings that aren't electrified doing if we've eliminated gas to them, which is phase 3? So I think there's some little inconsistencies. I mean, if we're 100%, we're 100%. I don't know why we say numbers that are less than 100%.
I think we're making conservative estimates, knowing that it might be challenging to hit 100. And
So you're
that's
saying
where
we're going
our-
to fail, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying we're going to fail. I just think we're leaving a little bit. Our consultants created a calculator for us, as we mentioned a couple meetings back, where you can kind of play with the numbers and figure out to what extent you have to hit your targets paired with your sequestration goals you have in mind. And we left ourselves a little bit of wiggle room because
Oh, so they're saying if we achieve this, we will
Carbon
achieve
neutrality.
zero because
neutrality.
we have other sequestration things that are making up for the loss in
Mm-hmm.
those areas.
So these are goals. We can always go past our goals.
No,
but
I
these
just,
are-
to me, I was having a complete disconnect there because we've eliminated natural gas and yet 10% of the buildings are still on it. So I didn't understand how that would work under building electrification. So anyway, if it sounds like some things will limp along, but we're sheltering them under sequestration somehow, I guess.
Sorry.
If we, that there will be some non-totally compliant with our zero carbon production goals, but that carbon will be offset by some sort of sequestration elements that we do. So our sort of net works over. I mean, I was never quite clear how the carbon-free economy fit in, because that's not something we can even really measure. I mean, it's good things to do. I don't think we shouldn't do it, but it's not the carbon that we're measuring in as part of the zero carbon, right? Yeah. So it's a little, I don't know. I think the metrics are getting a little jumbled up there.
I don't understand, what do you mean that it's not?
We don't measure that part. All we measure is what we're emitting, what we're creating ourselves, not what we buy created.
But I think the point is that a carbon-free economy contributes to emissions reductions.
Right, but we have no way of measuring them.
Right, but
Yeah.
I mean, no, I'm not saying there isn't a value. I think it's important to put it in there. But essentially, Albany's zero carbon by 2045 is being achieved by building electrification and low carbon transportation. That's where it's happening. But I think it's good to include that in there. It's just, and this graphic changed from before, where it was more like they actually were making up the components of the zero. And so I like this a little bit better now, because it's not displayed in that way. So that was an improvement. Let's see. Household or business entity, right? It's not like some sort of combined group, because I mean, we have 1,000 less being low. So one question that kind of brings up is, it seems like, you know, $1,000 investment might be not very much for some families in Albany, but could be a lot for somebody else that's maybe just renting and doesn't want to invest that much in a place they're just renting. So anyway, I know these things have to be kind of looked at, but I think what it leads to is we should think about sliding scales on some of the incentives and others that come up. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. 36. Oh, I was kind of curious about the 25% reduction in passenger vehicle miles traveled.
Sorry, what was the question?
You know, in the active transportation, our 2045 target is a 25% reduction in
page are you
passenger. I'm on 36. I'm just kind of curious how 25% was. What's driving that number? You know?
I'm not sure right now. I don't have the little calculator in front of us, but like I mentioned, we plugged all these numbers in and fooled around a little bit, and this is like a realistic goal that could help us meet our carbon neutrality target.
Yeah, okay, I see. It's just like get the numbers down. Realistically, we get 25%, and then the rest will be taken up by, you know, hopefully people going to electric vehicles. Yeah, okay. 1.1.1. Yeah, I'll wait on that one. 1.1.3. When it says research feasibility emissions reduction impact of implementing, I would rather have it say, implement a parking management strategy. I don't think we need to research it. I mean, that'd be part of it, so.
Sorry, can I interrupt for a second? I realize we may not have shared with you our plan for tonight, and I was distracted by AV issues. But I just want to clarify, we're bringing this to council on December 2nd as a final climate action plan? That was shared? Okay. So we don't actually have time to incorporate edits, but we can take your feedback and provide it, as an amendment to or an addendum to our staff report. But we don't have a lot of time to do that either.
I realize anything I say here is not going to change this if it goes
Okay,
to.
okay.
But
Just wanted to
I'm just
clarify.
bringing it up, and if some of these seem significant enough, I mean, I haven't heard anything that's the ones you brought up, but, and we'll see what public says, but if some of them are significant enough, maybe we do want to have a little edit before it goes back, and we can certainly discuss that. So and I thought I had brought this up before, but I think, using research feasibility and I guess in my mind, we should be saying what we're going to be doing. I mean, we can study things still, but studying doesn't accomplish anything. So, especially on that particular one, because I think it's going to be highly unpopular, but it's going to be the best way to have an impact on vehicle ownership and type of vehicle ownership. Otherwise, we won't have any influence at all if we just consider it being a volunteer basis thing. So, again, thinking in terms of incentives and disincentives, it should really be built into the plan how we're going to accomplish that. But anyway, hopefully it does lead to implementing it and not just studying it. So a lot of, let's see.
I agree with that. I think that's a valid point.
There's still seems to be at 2.2.7, which I'll give you the page. 42. This is going to be, I mean, there's some big hurdles here. These are all good ideas, but again, the incentives and how you bring about, especially changes for landlord-owned buildings to become energy compliant, it's still pretty vague and needs to be worked out. So, I have some ideas on that, but it would have been nice if there was something more developed in that. So, I'm still scratching my head on how we get all the landlords to agree that they're going to improve the energy efficiency and carbon production of their buildings. And then everything else was, well, then getting on to, I think this was talked about, implementation. I just want to plug my thing again, that we're really going to need, since most of the implementation is not outlined here. I mean, there's certainly a concept of when it should happen, roughly what kind of costs are involved in a very sort of broad brushstroke sense. But someone is going to need to really be the driving force to getting this through, all the bureaucratic hurdles and bringing together all the partners and making these studies happen and do all that. So I was always plugging that the plan would also be approved with someone dedicated 100% to just implementing the plan. And I've heard that, we've got Lizzie here now and Claire, you're here, and between the two of you, that's 100% person, but I get a little worried because I know there's a lot of other things still on both of your plates. So I would like to know how the city is going to implement the plan, because it is not explained in the implementation process at all. It just says the city's going to do it. Is there a budget for it? Is there a time frame? It's all kind of very undefined.
We'll be bringing a discussion of plan implementation to the meeting after the plan is adopted by council. So that'll either be December or January, or when the meeting after it is adopted by council.
It sure be nice to get the city council to commit some sort of budget to it ahead of time, but anyway, It's a plan. It needs to be implemented. If it doesn't get implemented, it's worthless. So implementation is critical. Anyway, that's all I have.
Okay, so thank you for putting so much effort and work into putting together the plan. Sorry, I don't have my microphone on. So my main comment
On the bottom, I think.
would echo Nick's, which is the plot on page 18 seems, well, first of all, I think there's a lot of text in the introductory parts of the plan about Albany being a climate leader, which is a fine aspiration. However, when I look at the plot in figure 18, again, the goal in 2035 is the same as it was 3 or 4 years ago at 60% reduction. And the 2045 carbon neutrality goal is the same as the government's executive order. So in
Those were set by council at their last meeting.
I understand, but I missed the last meeting, so I think it's okay for me to comment on this. But at any rate, this is something that I submitted as a formal comment to staff in September, echoing sentiments of the community, including those of Dan Johnson and probably those of Nick as well. So I am very disappointed by the council's decision. I think also, given that the actual reduction in 2020 is exceeding the target by a significant margin, either 30% or 33%, depending on whether or not Western Forge and Flange is included, that we should be more aggressive and not less aggressive in the medium term, and that to be a climate leader, we should be more aggressive than the state. So I'd be fine if we change the text to Albany is, following the state rather than exhibiting climate leadership, because this to me is not exhibiting leadership. Also, I think what's important for the planet is cumulative emissions, which is to say the area under the curve. So when you slow down the pace of emissions reduction, you're increasing cumulative emissions. So you really want to steepen the curve to reduce the cumulative carbon emissions. So I think this is definitely the wrong signal to the community, and this is very inconsistent with the stated aspirations in the introduction of Albany as a climate leader. So I'm very disappointed with this. We did make this comment, I think, more than once. I think there may have been a motion. I don't recall, I'm sorry, to do this as well, but I understand that the council has approved this, but this to me is not leadership. To me, this is just being a follower. Despite all of the good efforts, I think this is the bottom line, really. What are our targets? What are we aiming for as a community and as a city in 2030, in 2035, in 2040, and 2050? 2045 and 2050. So that is my main comment, and I think we should really, I would like to make a motion to the committee that we update this to reflect true leadership, and whether or not we meet the goal is subject to debate, and how we finance and how we incentivize. I mean, this is a plan to make plans, is how I'm reading this. We need a plan for EVs. We need a plan for electrification. That is not a plan. That's just kicking things down the road. So ultimately, I think we need to take a strong position here to change this plot. This is one of the most important plots in the plan. So I think we really need to tighten things up, be more aggressive, steepen the curve, and not kick things down the road. This is exactly what Nick is saying. When you look at the slope of the curve, the steepness of the curve does not accelerate until 2035. That's in 16 years. So that would be my main comment.
Make a motion.
So I make a motion that we change the carbon neutrality target to 2040, and we therefore steepen the curve and increase the target in 2035 to, I think I had proposed 90% in the past. So that's what I would propose.
Can I make a suggestion before
Yeah, go ahead.
Before you move forward with that motion, you already actually have that on the books, and we shared that with
Okay,
council.
okay.
So,
That's what I thought.
yeah, so I mean, you're welcome to do it again, but I urge you to consider adopting the or asking the council to adopt the plan. And if you're not comfortable with the plan, you could say, ask the council to adopt the plan with suggested changes such as those.
I am not comfortable with the plan. I'm not comfortable with adopting this plan as it stands. That's my vote.
But my suggestion is, if you're uncomfortable with adopting the plan, then I suggest you choose something as a committee to say to council with very clear expectations of how the plan might be changed so council can review those. Otherwise, they may adopt the plan without any changes. Does that make sense? I want you to be clear about what you want changed, and we can share that with them.
So maybe just a little discussion before we make a motion. Sure. I mean, I respect what your viewpoint on that. I somewhat disagree because
I changed it. It's
you've been doing this longer than I have, and I certainly get your perspective on what this is trying to convey. On the leadership aspect of it, it seems to me just over the last year or two that the numbers have shifted a lot. I mean, when we first came in, the Climate Action Plan numbers, the goals were, like I think 10 years beyond that, and it's fantastic that the state is trying to move that closer based on the climate science as it's changing. So I was actually really happy that the City Council made a change in the goals in the short time that we've been reviewing this over the last year. So this maybe isn't perfect. It's not maybe as aggressive as we might want it to be, but overall, this is a pretty aggressive plan, and it meets the state where a lot of cities are not meeting the state goals. So in that terms, I think you have to look at leadership in terms of what are we doing to act, and I think that this is a leadership position because we are putting together a plan that shows that our goal is to meet the state goal, and that is an aggressive goal. And I think that if every community had the same kind of focus on it, we could actually achieve it. So I think Albany is a leader in that position. I think that you're probably right that the slope of this curve should be different, but I really don't feel like I would want to throw out this plan or hold it up any further for this. I think we need to get into the implementation phase. This is a better plan than we had in the 9 years ago. And the implementation activities are the next phase. And I think we need to get to that and say, let's start working on it. And that's where the leadership's going to come in, I think. So I would say let's take this plan as it is and say, yes, and the implementation is going to be critical, City Council, and we need money, staff, and the freedom to operate to implement it. And then 5 years from now, revise this and, with the better climate science. That's my perspective.
Yeah, in going to the city council meetings and watching when the decision was made to move up to 2045, I mean, the whole reason for doing that was that a lot of people spoke very passionately that we should at least, we weren't even matching what the state was, and we need to move that. So I think there was a focus on the carbon neutrality goal, which is the ultimate at the end goal. But what I think is really critical now is that early years are much more important than later years. And you're much more able to do things that it's like investing money and interest. And that's why I agree with Max on this, although I don't know if we'll have much luck and I understand City Council wanting to, sometimes if you're on the bleeding edge, can you really do it or not? Do you have the resources to do it? But what probably bothers me the most is that we exceeded what we thought we were going to do, the 25%, by a healthy amount, which may or may not be because a certain industry left town. It may or may not be because it just got warmer and people didn't need to heat their homes as much. But for whatever reason, we clocked ahead. So that should give us optimism in that we can, in these critical years now, which we'll never get back. I mean, these years, they've told us, the next 10 years, these are the most critical. We should do as much as possible. So to just decrease the amount of, or just stay the same, it's like that, I mean, we should at least really show a strong effort. I mean, if anything, we should just straight line it down, but just to sort of back off and then expect that we're going to crank it up at the end. It's completely antithesis of what's really going to happen. What's going to happen is we've already done the low-hanging fruit. Now we're getting into the real difficult stuff. And the real difficult stuff is going to take longer to implement and put in place. So even if we do steepen the curve for things now, it's going to flatten out as we get to those last ones. It's completely a mistake. It's like not saving for retirement. Say, well, I'll save when I retire. No, you can't save when you're already there. So again, I agree with Matt. I mean, even I think we need to, and I realize it was written in the original plan. It didn't get as much publicity, but just scooching up the end point and leaving everything else the same is not being aware of what these critical, we need to address it now issues are. So my recommendation, I mean, I would just eat it on the, I mean, I think your points are right. We're matching the increased state one. We're ahead of a lot of other communities. I think there's some leadership in that, but I would like to see us move the 2035 goal up, to 2030.
Can I clarify one thing about this conversation? I just want to double check. So you're talking specifically about the numbers in the curve and you're not talking about the measures. And I just want to make sure, do you feel
no, the
like
measures are very broad and they come in. I mean, I don't think this curve is driven by the measures. It's just saying this is what our goals are. And there's not enough detail in the measures and when they're implemented and by when and who does them and how they're even done to know how it's going to impact this curve. Everyone's just hoping it follows this.
So you're not satisfied with the actions that are listed in the CAB?
Oh, I think at this point they are what they are. I mean, I think the actions outline a very broad approach, but there's no specifics. There's no methodology. There's no steps.
Yeah.
It's just we're going to go to 25% reduction in rides.
Well, that's all part of our implementation plan. Are you comfortable with having this conversation as part of the implementation plan, which is an opportunity to talk about timelines and how aggressive we can be?
No, I agree with Max on this point. I think that we need to have a much more, I think we're dropping the ball or we're not responding correctly if we don't cinch up what we do in the next 10 years.
I think the concern is that the reason why we are ahead of the target has to do with East Bay Clean Energy. Nothing that the city has really implemented has had a bigger impact or anything that's gone on. And so that is low-hanging fruit. We got that. Now the city has to do some things that are going to have a dramatic impact, going to change some things in how we operate. And that's the concern, is that the hard part starts now. We can't wait. And the curve has to be flattened out. So instead of 60% by 2025, it needs to be 75% or something like that is more in line with the reduction that we need to make ahead of time. And I think we could pass a motion expressing our concern, because maybe we do want to approve this, but we want to convey to council that we're concerned that this intermediary target here is not going to bring about the kinds of changes that Albany needs to make. Something along those lines.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a, people are still thinking 2045. It's still off too far away. Too many people are saying, well, I'm going to be, 90 by then, so what do I care? And we know from what all the climate scientists are telling us, the next 10 years are extremely critical. Not the next 15 years, the next 10, maybe even less. I'm sure by the time we get to the next climate summit with the UN, it's going to be the next 5 years. You know, I mean, the whole thing's accelerating now. So again, looking at this, it would be better, even if you do a straight line from the 33% down to the 0, you're going to clip 60% right around 2030.
So what I'm kind of weighing is that this, you know, for the citizen of Albany that's looking at this, it's a communication vehicle that says there are significant, drastic changes that need to happen over the next 20 years. And that's the message. I think we are so close to it. It's like, yes, you're right. The inflection should be different if we really, but as a communication vehicle, it's saying, here's the end point, 2045. And, you know, how we get there, for the average person, they're not going to think, I don't think they're going to worry that much about what the interim targets are that much. It's, yeah, we need to take significant action. I just don't think it's worth, you know, tossing out the plan or you know.
No, I'm not, no one's saying, look, this is a simple change. It's just, what I'm suggesting is we still have 2045. You make this graph, and wherever there's reference to it, we're going to go to 2030 for the 60%. It's just when I look at this graph now, it's like, oh, well, we can just keep doing what we're doing until 2035, and then maybe we'll start, you know, knuckling down and getting to work.
But
And that's
correct me if I'm
totally the
These are
wrong.
based on the goals that are adopted by city council at this point. So to change this curve, you'd have to be changing the targets, which goes back to having city council change the target dates, right?
I just echo what
This is our plan.
Yeah, I just echo what Nick says, that if you go out to 2035, which is the near term, 15 years, there's no change. There's absolutely no change. So, you know, to me, that's like there's no plan, because that was our city plan document target that we changed as a recommended measure or recommended motion from this committee about 3 years ago, and yet there's no change. And so it just seems like it doesn't represent a very aggressive position, and it doesn't represent a position of leadership. And if you look at the other cities, they are all with the executive order from whenever, 2006, for 80% in 2050. So I don't think that should be our benchmark at all. That's 10, 13 years old.
I think the point that staff is making is that we either approve it or we don't approve it. What I'm suggesting is that we approve it, but we indicate that we have a grave concern that council's not addressing this with a kind of urgency in terms of what we think this graph represents.
Well, I mean, I just speak to one comment that the chairman, Eric, you made, which is that people don't really care about the intermediate targets. That's actually what we spend most of our time, or I felt like we spent a lot of our time discussing the past 4 or 5 years, is are we on target? Do we need to do more? You know, is there a CCA? You know, what should we recommend? So I think actually we do spend a lot of time and effort on that. So I think that is important.
Didn't mean that the interim targets aren't important. It's 60% reduction is a big target already. I mean, it is an interim target.
Sure.
I think it's moving us in the path on the right direction.
Right. I just feel fundamentally
It's
we just step back.
it's slower progress than we made in the last 10. So we're slowing down if you do that.
Yeah, I
I
just
mean,
feel
we did 33, and then you're doing another, 17, 18, 27. So it's slowed down. It's slowed down from 33 to 27. It just seems like it has to get, if anything, it has to increase even more. I mean, also because I know we're going to miss it. That's the other thing, is we kind of lucked out on these other ones, but now we're down to where we have to really make people do some things they don't want to do, which essentially spend money. And we did get this big, as Tom mentioned, we got this big gain with nobody having to spend money, just by all the efforts that went through creating East Bay Community Energy and convincing people to do it. So if there was a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, I'd say, yeah, this is going to be a no-brainer, but we're going to hit up against some really difficult things. I mean, even, you ask people to switch their water heater and they start crying about the cost. So which in some sense you could say, well, yeah, maybe we will hit 60 at 2035, but I think we should at least be striving so, you know, I don't know. It's the next 10 years. It's not the next 15 years. And this plan essentially says we're going to slack off and then we're going to try to catch up at the end. That's how I read it. And it's the wrong message to send. So I don't know, clarify with me, Claire and Lizzie, why couldn't we just have them change the 2035 to 2030 and make that our 60% goal and modify this one page, and then wherever it says 2035, just do a hunt search and replace with 2030.
You
And
can
then-
ask council whatever you'd like to ask. I can't say what they will do. They've chosen the 2035 by 60 target at their last meeting. They also chose that
I
per the
didn't get the
committee's
sense that they
suggestions.
chose that. I got the sense that they just left it that way. I mean, I didn't
Yeah,
hear-
we can ask for them to do that. I urge you to keep with 2035 because that's in line with our general plan goals. That's why we have that date.
Does it have to be in line with our general plan goals?
Doesn't have to, but that's why we did it.
So, I mean, I agree it'd be expeditious and less work to just leave it the way it is and send it on, but I am not geared, I mean, in my mind, we're making a statement here to our citizenry and what the expectations are, and I think that's more important. I mean, I'm sorry I didn't focus in on this earlier and could push it more at the city council meetings, but again, until this graph came up and I could really see that, it just doesn't convey urgency. You know, it doesn't convey what the climate scientists are telling us and where I think we should be to be, as Max says, the climate leader. And if we're going to lead, we need to push harder now and hope that we can make the 100% by 2045. You know, anyway, so that's my question is, could we make a motion here to change that, and then you can investigate whether we can? And
Before you make any motions, I suggest taking public comment.
well, that would be fine too. I'm very interested to hear what people have to say. So, should we do that now?
Yeah, we can open it for public comment. Go ahead. Can you come to the podium?
Yeah, David Wemmer, resident. I totally agree with Nick and Max. You know, this is kicking the can down the road. We have 10 years. In my mind, you know, we should be drawing this line, you know, going to 100% at 2035. And so, you know, for me, I would rather get it right and wait a month or two, because this is, you know, a 25-year plan. And I know how it is. Everybody's put in a lot of work. It's been, you know, a lot of time. And it's like, we're almost there. We're going to get it through council, you know, get it to council and get it through. But I think I totally agree. It's critical that, you know, this is the vision of where we're going, and we are just kicking the can down the road. I really can. What I could see is maybe continuing the slope for a couple of years, because we got the implementation plan. We got to, you know, get some more specifics. But you figure after a couple of years, we're going to be enacting some of these, implementing some of these measures, and they ought to be making a difference. And we ought to be steepening that slope and heading, you know, down to 100% way sooner. If we leave it like this, and it goes forward, you know, people will, you know, when we don't meet our goals, they're going to say, well, this was our plan. And that's what I don't like about your approach, Eric, is, you know, is this conversation is going to be lost in the future, and people will just look at it and go, well, you know, we were almost, you know, there, and this isn't adequate. You know, there's hard decisions. Now's the time to step up and make and start the fight, and not kick the can down, and show a vision in this plan that is more aggressive. And I'm wondering, Ken, so if you approve it and with comment, can the comment be you provide a revised graph, to council and say, we approve the plan, but we strongly disagree with this in the previous decision, and our recommendation is you adopt it with our change, and you give them the replacement page that shows a steeper curve. And if you can, and maybe that's a way to do it. And if you can't do that, or you could, maybe me as a citizen, with some support, we show up and hand out the revised graph and say, this is what we're demanding. Maybe the citizens can do it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It's quite interesting. Thank you to staff and consultants I don't think are here, but for putting this together. I think it is a huge improvement over the cap. The cap had items in it like prepare for peak oil. Well, I wish we had that problem. I actually opposed the inclusion of that in the cap because I thought it was nonsense, and it's turned out to be total nonsense. So I think there's a lot less nonsense in this plan than the last one, which is helpful. I agree completely that the 60%, we should have a target for 2030. 2035 is so far out that it's not going to motivate policymakers to make the hard decisions. So for instance, that illustration, it's not just an illustration, it's actual goals that the policymakers are going to be politically held to account for. And that's the visualization of those goals, but it's the goals that matter. And so if the 60% goal out at 2035, and we've already gotten to 33% in 10 years, and we'll have to go another 27% in 15 years, then the councils in the near term are going to be like, I'm not going to make the hard political decision because I'm going to be out of office in 8 years. So what do I care? They'll talk a good game, but when the vote comes down, they won't take the vote that needs to be taken. So an example is this body's recommended over and over and over a utility user tax increase. Finally, I think there's a more viable spend plan for that. Are we going to get this council to put it on the ballot in 2020? Well, if the goal is 2035, I can very well see them saying we don't need to deal with that right now. Whereas if it's 2030, then there's more pressure on them to do it. So I would advocate that there's a goal at least every 10 years, and that the goal should be 60% in 2030, and there should probably be a 2040 goal as well, because 15 years is just too long in a democratic system to motivate the people who are elected to do what needs to be done. Speaking for strollers and rollers on actions 1.1.1 and 1.1.2, they talk about low-stress cycling infrastructure. This is actually a little bit of a step back from the cap. So the cap had stage 1 cycling infrastructure, stage 2 cycling infrastructure. Stage 1 was cycling lanes, paint, basically. Stage 2 was motorist separated. And motorist separated is what's shown in research and worldwide experience is where you really get the dramatic change in the number of people that choose to bike for transportation. And so by not citing motorist separated infrastructure specifically, it will give future policymakers a pass to say, well, we painted some bike boulevards, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that does not make the difference. So Strollers and Rollers asks you emphatically to recommend that those actions specifically put the target on motorist separated cycling infrastructure. Also, the cost between those two seems inverted. The cost for the plan is over $250,000, and the cost for the infrastructure is under $250,000, which doesn't make any sense. So that needs to be corrected. And with your forbearance, I have a few more comments, but I'll sit down if you want me to sit down.
I'm willing to hear them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was quite excited to see that mandatory seismic retrofit ordinance has made it in as an action. It's under the resilience section, which certainly increases resilience, but not related to climate hazards. Earthquakes are not a climate hazard. I think its appropriate place in this plan would be under carbon-free economy, because there's discussion here that construction waste is one of the biggest waste streams, and after an earthquake, it's going to be a tidal wave of waste. And so it's not really an issue for climate resilience, it's an issue for carbon-free economy. So I would just suggest recommending moving that action. The names of the sort of overall themes, accelerate resilience for all, you know, it's kind of a term of art that we understand, but I don't know that it's going to really convey much or communicate much to people who just see the, you know, the 4 themes listed. So I've suggested in the past that it should say something like mitigate climate hazards or reduce climate hazards, prepare for climate hazards. You know, that's language that I think is going to be much more readily understood by the average person. And then it's kind of the same thing with carbon-free economy. I've suggested changing that to reduce, reuse, recycle, since it's already a phrase that people understand. It has a lot of marketing behind it, and it essentially gets to the same thing. Page 10 has a graph of historical measured extremes. The forecast, well, one, the history needs to be boosted up. It's like in a very light gray, so you can't hardly see what's going on. So if that line weight, that line color, whatever, could be boosted so people could actually see it. And then the last 20 years, the number of heat days that we've had on average per year is not what the forecast projects we should have until 2060. So we're already at 2060. So I question whether the forecast should even be shown. It seems erroneous for our area. It's not even modeling where we're at today.
Yeah, it almost drops in 2020, starts over again.
Yeah. So thank you very much, again, for your forbearance and letting me comment further. And again, on behalf of strollers and rollers, I mean, you've heard this comment over and over from individuals, but now strollers and rollers, seeing that there's been no change in this, is stepping in and saying the focus needs to be on motorist-separated cycling infrastructure. We are not going to get a 25% reduction in passenger mileage by painting some bike boulevards and some bike lanes.
All right, thanks. Any other comments? Yeah.
I'm Lucinda Young. I'm a longtime Albany resident, and I just want to reflect that I share Nick and Max's concern that this graph is not consistent with what the climate scientists are telling us, that the next 10 years are critical. And we've got to act. It's not reflecting the urgency. And that's my concern. I have not carefully gone through the entire plan, but that is the most blatant problem that I see with the plan. And as the previous speaker, Dave Wimmer, reflected, I think it's best that we deal with it now. And I know the feeling that, hey, we want to just get something through, but I think this is important enough that we need to get it right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi again. My name is Hillary Sardinas. I'm an Albany resident. I should also say I'm on the Park Rec and Open Space Commission, not here in that capacity. I'm also the biologist for the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. I've commented multiple times at my other commission and in public comments that Alameda County RCD should be included as a partner. We are, besides Stop Waste, the only organization doing active carbon farming in Alameda County. We also support a lot of other public resources and sustainability initiatives. So wouldn't have to work with me, but I do think that our organization has a lot to offer, and I think that they should be included. I also think that it's interesting that agriculture is not really mentioned in the report. I applaud that farmers markets are something, and having one in Albany would be fantastic. But there are some urban farms and community gardens in Albany. There are also opportunities to expand that and also expand education around home gardening, home composting, just other ways to increase food security here in Albany while also having a beneficial climate impact. And I really do think that that's something that belongs in a plan like this. And so I think that's a missed opportunity. Especially school gardens, or even like the One Square Smile school in preschools. I think like a toddler garden or something like that would also be fantastic. But I will also say that I'm a believer in getting to the teeth of things and getting towards implementation. And I think a lot of where this plan is going to lead is how it's implemented. So while I do think that there are some revisions and some recommendations you can make to council to tweak the plan, I do urge you to try and move it forward speedily. I applaud all the work that you've done. I think it's a really fantastic, comprehensive plan that has a lot of potential, and I'm excited as an Albany resident to get to participate in some of the initiatives, so thank you for that. But I do really want to get to that implementation phase and see how that goes, and look forward to coming to future meetings and seeing how you can implement these pieces.
Thanks. Any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to do a little, there was something in resilience, I think, about
I-
farmers market. but
I
anyway.
just, I appreciate the input and the planned goals. I didn't expect that to be, I didn't see that as being the big issue. And I really take your, we're all here because we're really interested in getting this plan implemented and going. That part of, we've had these planned goals have been in the draft plans for the last 2 versions of the plan. Since September, we've had the 2035 60% reduction goal. So if we want to stop and make a more aggressive goal and do that, I hear the point of let's get it right the first time. That makes sense. But we've been looking at this for a long time. So.
Well, and I think a lot of comments has gone out multiple times, and I think Max or somebody, we stressed this, but we certainly fought on getting the 2045 moved in, and I think the council the last time people understood that. So again, it takes iterative looking at things sometimes to sort of work it out. Anyway, I'm kind of curious in knowing if we, I think there is a big concern. I have a big concern. Other people have a big concern. We've heard the audience say there's a concern that if we don't make a more aggressive plan for the next 10 years, this is not sending the right message. So my question then, staff, would be, what would be the process of conveying that to council? I would rather put the effort into seeing if we could amend this to at least show something that was putting that initial aggressiveness in now versus later. I realize that's extra time now, but I think it's important to get us launched out on the right goals. What's our hurdles there?
I'm sorry. So the question is the process for taking it to council now with the recommendation change or prolonging the process? What's your question?
What we would like to do is get when this goes out, once the council approves it, it goes out, it's copied, it's on the website, it's all over the place. This is what we're shooting for. Everyone who's on the council now will look at these goals, and this is what they'll plan around, and this is what's all mapped out. So we're saying, maybe it's belatedly, maybe, sorry about that, but we're just saying this doesn't reflect the current urgency that has just come up in, the last 8 or 9 months since we had the UN Council and the climate science reports about the 10-year criticality. So rather than trying to readjust everyone's sense of the goals later after it's published as these are the goals, is there any way to get this corrected now to something that reflects that urgency?
So I think you're talking about moving that 60% goal in to 2030 or something before.
Well, that might be one. Max has a suggestion here that we just straight line it to 2040 as a zero from where we are now at the 30%. But I don't know. That's
You're
my
asking for a
question.
staff suggestion. The staff recommendation is to approve to recommend that council approve the climate action plan as is. If you would like to suggest amendments, then my recommendation would be to pass a motion that approves or that recommends the cap to council with suggested changes. And those changes ideally would be specific.
So in your evaluation, that's the better way to try to get this urgency across, is to just approve this and then work at amending it later. And any confusion and information that gets out ahead of time that isn't backing it up, I mean, how is that better than just taking the extra time to get this adjusted to what we think is more appropriate for the urgency?
We've been given direction that this is going to council in December. I can't say that they'll approve it or not approve it, or that they'll want to make changes or not. I can't speak for them. But we've been given direction that it's going to council. So my recommendation to you is to suggest the changes that you want to see to them
Okay, so
directly.
I think if we pass this here, I'm going to be going to council and ask them not to approve this as a member of the Climate Action Committee.
The
and that they
committee
should
wants to
send
make
it
that
back
motion,
to
that's
us.
fine.
So I think that would take even longer. So you're still saying that there's no administrative way. Well, maybe I should just sort of ask the rest of the committee, is this a big enough deal? Should we try to change it after the fact? Should we put it, I mean, what are other people's?
Council has to make this decision on the targets either way. So we'll have to bring this question to them.
So we could actually argue this point to council, and then they could recommend that you take it back. So
Or that
one-
we just make the change.
So one avenue would be we approve this now, but with the recommendation that they change the targets to whatever we agree on here, and that in the interest of getting this out expeditiously, that they just approve it with our recommended amendment, and then we have the consultant make the amendment.
Do you have to recalculate some of the targeting if we move the 60% to 2030? Or whatever a straighter line would be, whether it's doing that or changing the 60% to 75. What would be required on your part to make that change before we took it to council?
No, I think it would just, if we keep the 2045 target, everything's the same. Changing the interim target doesn't change any of the end goal calculations.
And it's true that the council didn't address the 60% reduction by 2035. Was that part of the council discussion?
The targets were part of the discussion, but I don't know that they didn't, I don't remember them having a robust
Right.
discussion on the interim.
So I think.
But it was it was part of the discussion on the
Right.
slide in the staff
I
report.
mean, the big thing was getting the council to change it to carbon neutral by 2045. So I think if we,
Your suggestion of 90% by 2035 was discussed and
right,
not
I'm suggesting is we make
taken.
the graph continue that reduction, so that if we change the other numbers, rather than, we're not going to change the end point. We're talking about changing the intermediary target. Why can't we so we can pass a motion that says that the intermediary target is changed. And that's not, I mean, doesn't sound like it was controversial, so I think.
I don't think there's any harm in that. You're not authorized to make that decision ultimately. The council
Right,
has to make it.
it's a
That's the snag.
right.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a recommendation, and we know we're not.
So where would that leave us? That would be making a motion to revise the interim target goal.
Right.
And pass the climate action plan.
Right,
Approve the climate action plan.
with that or whatever changes that we are recommending. So I think that's probably the proper way to proceed is with
Nick and Max, what do you think of that?
I think it would behoove you to do it that way and to make a recommendation with the plan as a whole. I think it won't look good if you choose not to recommend it, but if you're uncomfortable with it, by all means, you can do that and then speak to it directly at the meeting.
We're saying we approve it with we recommend it with the following, with the following changes, and then we outline
Yeah.
whatever those changes would be. So we could do several motions for each change that we want to make, because you wouldn't say, here are the 5 things we want to make. So perhaps the first one is
You
to.
could do it all in one motion, but we just give us the list.
Right, so let's talk about the first one. What, if it was going to be a straight reduction, if we changed the goal at, to 60% by 2030, what would that do to this line? How do you straighten out this line?
That's a question.
Sorry. I wrote a little equation that has I can change it based on when we want to end it, and then I can calculate, and I can just find different points along it.
So what would be if 2020 is 33% and 100% is 2045, what is it at 2030?
Is this the one that looks like this, or the one that would be a straight line?
It's going to be a straight line.
Okay, so just with consistent reductions until 2045, starting at 100 in 2010, our value at, what did you say, 2030?
No, what I'm saying is take 2020, we're already at 33%. So a line between 33% at 2020 down to 2045
Well, Max
at
has done that.
100%. Did you already figure it out, Max?
Well, I mean, it's about 60%, yeah. I mean,
So-
It's within plus or minus, yeah.
Okay, so if we change this and say that the goal is a 60% reduction by 2030, I think that would address what we're talking about.
That would be consistent with a straight line, more or less, reduction to 0 in 2045.
Right.
Right. I guess the question to the committee is, do we want to be just matching the state or to be more aggressive than the state? My working assumption is that we want to be more aggressive than the state, always. Because if we're just following the state, I guess I'm not sure why we're here, other than to support the state, which I think we all want to do. But consistent with what we have done historically is, as a walkable urban village right there, we should be more aggressive than the state, given all the natural advantages that we have as a community. So I think we went out with that as a motion 2 months ago, and it was also in my written comments 2 months ago. But I mean, that's what I would prefer and what I would recommend.
What are you proposing by 2030 then?
Well, I mean, so if we did adopt a 0 carbon neutrality target in 2040 with a straight line from today, that would translate to approximately
2045?
A 0 in 2040.
Oh, because that's what I was trying to avoid, because since the council already approved the endpoint, but didn't have a conversation about the 10-year goal or 15-year goal, I think that's an opportunity for us to recommend something that they would approve, rather than having them go back and debate whether it should be 100% at 2040. That might be more difficult to get them to
My
approve.
notes from July, we recommended, our proposal to the city council was 2035, 90% below 2004 levels, and 2040 carbon neutral. That was our proposal.
Right.
City council said, thanks very much, we're going to do 2035, 60%, and 2050 carbon neutral. And so then we got that changed to 2045 carbon neutral. So we have done this. We've proposed. We got their response. We know where the city council is.
So they,
So are we going to do that again? Is that what we're proposing?
I'd make a compromise suggestion. So I understand Max's very good point about trying to drive us more to being a leader and beating the state. I think as we turn the screws on this and people begin to realize how much they are really going to have to change their lifestyle. And if they're serious about this, there's going to be a lot of political blowback on this. So what I'm thinking might be a good idea is that we increase the acceleration towards what we want to a steeper curve for the interim goal to 70% at 2030, and then just keep the 2045. Because if we can stay on that, if we can implement things on that, then technically if we can keep it going down on that line, we'll hit 2040 anyway. We'll be ahead. So my interest is in trying to get as much now rather than pushing it down to after 2035. We may get nothing happening after 2035 because, I mean, it's just the changes you'd have to make would be so intense in such a short period of time that nobody's going to want to make them. So it's better to try to move the pain. In my mind, the steepness of the curve is the pain. And we need to get the pain a little bit more now because nobody will accept the degree of pain that a very steep curve towards the end will mean. So we need to have a steeper curve now than later. That's what we need. And that's the message that tells. So what I'm, rather than doing straight line to 2040, which I agree we'll probably never get by this city council, we just say we think for the reasons of the urgency and what climate scientists are saying, we should try to hit 70% by 2030, which is, if you look at all these others, I mean, is really a pretty good interim goal. I mean, we're probably beating most of the other communities around that are doing this. So.
And if we actually implement it, we'll be a leader. We'll actually be leading the way.
Well, and we're actually telling staff this is what we want to implement. I mean, I mean, this may seem like an academic lesson, but it's really telling the story of what we're trying to achieve. And if everyone knows that the initial achievement is steeper and more severe, they're going to work harder, and they know that that's being monitored, and that's what we're aiming for. So, I mean, I'm very sorry we didn't really realize the importance of the interim goal, but it's very clearly explained in this chart, which is setting us up for, and this graph is just setting us up for a pretty much a losing situation after 2035.
Okay, so the proposal that I heard was change the interim goal to 70% reduction by 2030.
Yeah.
Keep the carbon neutral goal at 2045.
Yeah.
And approve the plan with the recommendation that the interim goal be changed.
Right, and that's the only thing that changes, the interim goal.
Is that something that this committee can support?
I support that.
I would support that.
Okay, so should we make a formal motion? I'll make that motion.
I think what they're saying is let's identify all the changes and then make one motion, because there may be other changes that we want to make, not necessarily about this, right? That was
so
what you were recommending?
Not very clear.
Change number one.
So let's get the language on change number one. Do you have that?
I have written down changes 70% by 2030, keep the carbon neutrality at 2045, approve plan with interim goal change. So I guess the only change is 70% by 2035.
I guess for a point of order, we're already almost 10 minutes over. Should we make it okay to keep going?
Yeah.
We all okay with that? All right, thanks.
You said you guys had could you just run over the plan for the rest of the meeting after this, as far as the agenda goes?
Yes, after
Thanks. We're gonna probably have the table.
after the CAP discussion, we have the green building update, but then that's the end of the meeting.
But you could move that. That's
Yeah,
not
we can
something you
move
have
that.
to talk about tonight.
It was pretty broad, so I think, and we could use some more time on that anyway, don't you think, Tom? Yeah, so we're fine of moving that to next time.
So are there motions for other changes in the plan?
Yeah, one of the things.
Well,
I guess,
I just heard that we're supposed to get our list of changes into one motion.
I guess, Eric, I would view it a little bit different. I mean, just the way we communicate this, I would view it a little bit differently. That rather than saying we recommend the approval of the action plan, but with this one change, I would say we do not approve this plan unless this is changed. Because I think this is very key as a ground, a starting point for the plan. So I would just recommend that
could it be
phrase it a little bit differently, because I'm concerned that the council would just say, oh, okay, we accept that comment, but we like the approved part, but we don't really want to take the trouble or we don't want to change anything at this point, and let's just print it. And then we have 5,000 of these copies, and then, I'm pretty unhappy. I mean, I don't think that's what a lot of people in the community are not happy with. So that would be my concern. It's just that we're not really making don't know how this will be viewed by council as a strong, a very, very important change that needs to be made before we can approve this. It's just my sense of how it may be received, and a concern that it may be just dismissed.
So Elizabeth and Claire, I have a question here then. Could we make a motion that said, we support approving this plan with the following change? That's why I think it's important to keep it as simple as far as their understanding of it as possible. I say, we approve the plan with the following change. The interim goal should be 70% at 2030. End of story, and staff can then clarify to council what would be required then. It just means changing these graphics or doing whatever, and you can explain that it doesn't change any of the other aspects that we're still fixated on the 2045 zeroing out. At that point, I would recommend all of us, or as many of us as possible, be at the meeting to get up and speak and explain to council or take questions or whatever, unless we want to, put Eric forward as being the chair, would make the statement for us. But anyway, we can really reinforce that. There's a risk that not enough members will want to do that. Will maybe think it through and think it's too much of a step for their constituencies to be behind. But it could be that then they will accept it, and then staff will be in directing. How does that sound? I mean, does that sound like an approach that might get us where we want to be? Yeah, okay. So should I make a motion?
Yeah.
So wait, before you do that, so are we not considering any other changes? Is that what
No, and that change may ripple out, meaning certain pages now have to change some things, but we don't need to. That's just editing. That's just cleaning up. There are people here that probably like us to make some other changes, like protected bike paths on some of the others, but I don't know how they feel about that.
I think some of those things can be addressed in the implementation strategies.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is some of this is.
I think if thinking about it, if we have this one change that we're talking about, that is a strong message.
Yeah.
That really drives everything else.
Yeah.
That rather than giving them a list of things that we think should change. So I think
Right.
that's more powerful if it's.
I agree.
If
This should be the one and only thing we.
yeah.
And the only other approach would be, we just decide not to make, that we just bring it back and we get you guys to make the changes that we direct you to, and then we put it to the city council. But the problem with that is they're going to see things that are different from what they saw and talked about when they discussed the draft, right?
Can you prepare a revised graph for the city so they see what we're talking about?
Maybe you just put some data points on it, overlaying the already thing and just saying we're.
Yeah, literally draw.
Some way to graphically show them what we're talking about, a change in the graph, and
Yeah.
we can explain, and you can explain why we think that's important as a message.
Yeah, basically what this does is it just puts more pressure on the implementation to make some things happen faster, which haven't even been, the plan of implementation hasn't been established yet. So that we want to get this guidance in now, because if we try to do it later and it isn't done, then, you know, the implementation will level off at a different point, and we won't get the amount of change and the amount of time we need. So it's really, that's where the criticality of this is.
So did you want to make that motion? I like the language you just used.
Yeah, okay, so I make a motion that we send this plan on to council requesting approval with the change that the interim goal be revised from 60% in 2035 to 70% in 2030. And that this is critical for getting the correct implementation of what needs to happen in an earlier stage and phases of what will happen with the plan.
Is this with the implication that the final goal will stay the same?
Yeah, and I'm not, the final goal isn't
Yeah,
changed.
we're not, all right, and they don't have
That's
to
too
make
big of
any
a-
other revisions, so.
So I second that motion. So, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries.
Right.
Great. Okay. So I heard that we are thinking about tabling the green building discussion to next time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think we should.
It's 9:45.
All right, we can table that to next time. But, well, what we have on future agenda items is climate action adaptation plan implementation discussion. And then we have it on the list of future agenda items, the presentation on handheld equipment.
Can I ask staff a question about, is there any, getting somebody from planning and zoning to come and talk to us about what they're doing around the green building plan? Is that something, I thought Jeff talked to us about that previously. No? Having Ian?
I can check with Jeff. I know what they're doing right now with green building is the natural gas hookups ordinance. I think this committee is the one thinking about adopting one of the Cal Green tier, voluntary tiers. I don't think they have that on their agenda.
But is there a timing thing in terms of adopting the green building?
I think those can be adopted whenever. They don't
So
have to be adopted
But I
before.
mean, the planning and zoning is reviewing it as well, correct?
I don't know if they have any green. I don't think they have any green building things on their plate right now. I can check with Jeff and get
You're
back
not
to
bringing
you.
any staff report about the tiers to them, at least not at this point?
No, I think it was just going to this committee.
It was just to clarify, like, in terms of timing when we're addressing it, if there's a
No.
urgency.
No urgency. I think we were thinking that it would we could even continue it through January or February if we needed to. Yeah.
And Tom, you and Nick, are you guys doing a little research and can bring back?
yeah,
information?
we had a meeting the other night, and we discussed it, and Jeff wasn't able to attend that, otherwise we would have
So
asked him about the plan.
we need to have a meeting with Jeff before we come back.
Should I put that on the agenda for December?
Yeah.
At least maybe opportunity for an update?
Yeah.
Okay.
No large development projects coming down through the city?
Besides the Saha Affordable Housing Project, that's all electric.
Right.
That's the only one.
Thanks. I don't have any other things for future items,
Okay.
future agendas.
Maybe else future items?
No.
All right, I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second?
You just say it.
Do I just say we're adjourned?
Meeting
Oh,
adjourned.
okay.
You have
By the
authority to do
power
that.
vested in you.
All right, thanks.
Good job. That was good.
Thank you, folks.